There was a time, not so long ago, when each season arrived with ceremony. When the year, like a practiced host, made itself, it played long after they had gone. Notes hung in the air, faint but full, suspended in a space that no longer remembered the hands that once coaxed them into being. The music drifted like memory, weightless, bodiless, but real, filling corners and crossing thresholds, sounding out in places where no instrument sat, where no one waited for applause, where silence had long since taken up residence and made its peace. There had once been a quartet in the parlor, the kind that gathered every other Sunday without fail. They would tune carefully, quietly, with the same ease and rhythm as setting a table or lighting a lamp, not for concert halls or ovations, but for themselves, for the ritual of harmony, of breath shared and bowed strings trembling in sympathetic agreement. The chairs remain in that room still, empty, but not forgotten. Their legs scuff the floor with a certain pattern, and if one listens closely, they echo the timbre of a cello warming its voice. No one plays there anymore, and yet the air remembers. Music lingers differently than voices do. It doesn't need a body to anchor it. It doesn't require breath or lips or fingers. Once released, it belongs to the room it entered. It hides in the plaster and waits behind the molding, inside drawers that no longer open, and behind glass panes dulled by dust and time. Sometimes, if the afternoon light strikes at the right angle, or the wind slips through the window just so, you can hear it again, not with your ears, but in the bones of the house. A piano sits in the hallway. No one knows the last song played. The keys still respond, soft beneath hesitant touch, but it resists being awoken now. It's grown accustomed to rest. Sometimes, when someone passes by too quickly, one key clicks as if in protest or maybe invitation. The sound startles, not for its volume, but for its clarity. It reminds the listener that there was once music here. Not digital, not distant, but real, living and immediate, pulled from the air itself. And now, all that remains is the echo. There is an old radio in the kitchen, round knobbed, with its numbers half faded and its speaker faint as a whisper through a wall. It hasn't worked in years, yet someone still turns the dial from time to time, as if expecting it to find its voice again. And sometimes it does not, with news or speech or weather updates, but with a bar or two of melody, so brief it could be mistaken for memory. But it isn't memory. It's the ghost of a song, a few notes strung together from nowhere, filling the silence like dust motes floating through sunlight elsewhere in the house. The music takes different forms, a hum in the radiator, the sigh of wood contracting with the evening cool, the rhythm of footsteps no longer climbing the stairs but somehow still sounding in sequence. The walls breathe it in and out. The silence, too, participates, humming gently between the echoes, keeping time like a metronome held by an invisible hand. A music box rests unopened in a drawer. Its key remains wound, though no one wound it. Now and again, in the hush before dawn, it begins to turn slowly, carefully spilling a few hollow, tinkling notes into the dark. Not a full song, just the beginning, just enough to remind someone awake too early or too late that not all melodies need an audience. Some exist only to prove they still can. Music without musicians becomes something else. It becomes a presence, not haunting, but abiding, not performative, but gentle and unspoken, like a lullaby remembered just well enough to hum. It takes the shape of the place it fills. In the attic, it is the soft shuffle of paper. In the basement, it is the drip of old pipes and rhythm. In the hallway, it's the creak of the floorboard known too well to be startling anymore. There are no strings being tuned now, no fingers curled in position, no breaths held before the downbeat. But somewhere, always, something plays. A resonance in the bones, a vibration just below the threshold of attention. Music that needs no instrument, no skill, no sound, even. Only presence, only memory, only stillness where once there was rhythm. Sometimes someone visiting might ask, is that a record playing? And the answer is always the same. No record, no playlist, no speaker. Just the house, just the room, Just the sense that something once cherished has lingered longer than anyone expected, and longer than anyone asked it to. The rooms do not perform. They simply remember. On one shelf, tucked between books, lies a violin string snapped long ago. Its curl has faded, but the tension it once held remains in the air around it. You can almost hear what it meant to carry sound. And near it, a sheet of faded notation handwritten, with careful rests and sharp signs drawn as if in prayer rests beneath a paperweight. No one reads it, but no one throws it away either. It matters that it remains, because the absence of musicians did not still the music. It changed it, made it quieter, more patient, more willing to wait. There is a chair in the back room with a cushion worn in the exact shape of someone who used to sit there, evening after evening, strumming something soft and wordless into the warm air. The chair now sits in the corner, covered with a shawl and mostly forgotten. But the silence in that corner is different. It carries rhythm in its stillness. You can sit there and feel it, the hush of practice repetition, of comfort wrapped around sound. Outside, the wind catches the chimes on the porch. Their notes clash sometimes, not unpleasantly, but in a way that feels accidental, unwritten, yet somehow right, as though even the wind knows the measure. It knows when to pause. It knows the value of a held note. The world is filled with music left behind, hymns that outlived their singers, whistles on hillsides where no shepherd walks, lullabies hummed into quilts and coats and the corners of baby rooms now emptied. Each one persists not in noise, but in impression. Music without musicians is not a loss. It is an offering, the kind that asks nothing in return. It's a melody carried forward without ambition, without ego. A trace of beauty placed gently into the world and allowed to remain there, even when the hands that shaped it have long moved on to silence. If you close your eyes in the right kind of stillness, you can feel it. The unresolved chord. The phrase that ended mid-note but still lingers in the body like warmth. The breath before the next bar that never came. It is not unfinished. It is merely endless in its own way. Music without musicians does not stop. It simply disperses. Like ink in water, like light at dusk, it spreads thin but never disappears. You hear it in the way someone closes a door gently, not wanting to disturb a quiet they don't understand. You hear it in the pause between sentences, in the shush of someone setting down a mug with care, in the way someone clears their throat before saying nothing at all. This is where it lives now, not in concert halls, not in stages, but in the lived-in silence that has been shaped by sound, in the absence that still hums with presence, in the notes that were played and those that were not but should have been. And that, too, is a kind of music, one that cannot be composed, only kept, only felt, only held in the softest part of the evening, when the sky no longer asks to be noticed, and the air is still enough to listen. They stand in quiet corners and along forgotten roads, buildings once filled with noise and movement, now softened by the slow weight of time. Their walls are not empty. They are full of memory. Even if no voice calls out across their threshold, even if no one has stepped through their doors in years, they remember. They remember everything, especially the names. Names are no longer spoken aloud. Names that once echoed down halls were called up staircases, whispered behind doors, signed in chalk on slate boards, carved into wooden desks, or stitched into laundry tags left to dry in the morning sun. Names that pass between lips with familiarity, with fondness, and with formality. Names said in anger, in jest, in love. Names shouted across playgrounds or softly uttered into pillows at the end of long days. Names that belonged to people who once mattered, if only here, in this place. And the buildings remember. Their bricks do not forget the rhythm of footsteps or the specific weight of someone leaning against a frame. Their windows have seen the same hands open and close them through countless seasons. Their doors have creaked in the same way beneath the same familiar push. Inside these buildings, the air is still shaped by those who breathed it before. And if you stand quietly, you might feel it the way the space seems to shift slightly to accommodate a presence no longer there. Because long after the people leave, the buildings remain, not just in structure, but in spirit. The walls hold conversations like pressed flowers, fragile, flattened, but intact. They carry the last laugh shared in the kitchen. The argument was never quite resolved. The lullaby was sung in the nursery. The announcement was made from the porch steps. The knock on the front door came too late. The silence that followed it. Time peels the paint. Yes, it wears down the floors. The roof may sag, but the essence lingers, especially in buildings where no one comes anymore, especially in places left to themselves. The post office closed after the last letter was sent. The schoolhouse where the bell stopped ringing. The inn that hasn't welcomed a guest in decades. The chapel where no one has knelt in years. The farmhouse was abandoned after the family scattered like seeds in the wind. They sit and they remember. Not grand things, though some witnessed history, but small things, personal things. Names whispered only once and never again. Names that belong to those who lived lives too quiet to be written down but too real to be erased. There's a house somewhere with a child's drawing still taped to the refrigerator. The crayon colors faded and curling. The drawing is unsigned, but the house knows who made it. It remembers the hand that pressed it to the door, the way the child stood back and smiled at it. There's a shop whose windows reflect nothing now but the shifting sky, but it still knows the name of the woman who came every Wednesday at noon for bread. It remembers her footsteps and the pause she made before saying thank you. There's a theater where dust lies thick on the velvet seats, but it remembers the performer who stayed late to rehearse, again and again, long after the audience had gone home. It remembers their voice, the way it cracked slightly at the same note every time, and the breath they held before the final line. These are the names that no one speaks, not because they were unworthy, but because time moved on, as it always does. People left, generations turned over, papers were filed away or lost, photographs faded, and the names slipped into silence, carried only in the folds of forgotten buildings. But silence is not the same as absence. Within these places, the names are not gone. They are imprinted in the grain of the wood, in the dents on the banister, and in the scuffs on the floor where a chair was dragged day after day. The buildings remember, and they do not ask to be remembered in return. They do not cry out. They do not mourn. They simply wait. Wait in the way that only buildings can, with quiet patience, with steadfastness, with an unwavering presence that does not demand attention, but offers it anyway. They wait, holding within them a kind of prayer, not for revival, but for recognition, not to be filled again, but to be known for what they once held. If someone were to step inside again to brush away the dust, to breathe the still air, they might feel it, a pressure in the chest, or a sudden welling of unplaceable emotion. They might say, "It feels like someone just left," or "There's something about this place." They wouldn't be wrong, because the building has not forgotten. It remembers the man who sat in the same chair every morning, smoking the same pipe, looking out the same window. It remembers the girl who cried on the third step after her first heartbreak, the couple who danced in the kitchen while the soup boiled over, the grandmother who read letters by the fire, whispering each word as though summoning the writer back into the room. The names of those people are gone from the record. They are not in archives, not in books, not etched into stone, but they live here, in the way the floorboard creaks at a particular spot, in the smell that lingers even after the walls have faded, in the touch of light that falls exactly on the chair by the window every afternoon at the same time, just as it did when someone used to sit there and hum to themselves. Buildings are not alive in the way we are, but they have memory, and memory, when left undisturbed, deepens. It becomes a presence, a hush, a kind of gravity that draws the soul inward until one can almost hear the murmurs of lives long past, until one can truly feel the invisible threads that still stretch across the room. Threads woven from names no longer spoken aloud, but names that mattered. Once, someone wrote a name on the underside of a desk, just a first name, in pencil. It's still there, faded but legible. No one will erase it. No one has. Perhaps no one ever will. It wasn't meant to be seen, but it was meant to be remembered, and the desk remembers. So does the room, So does the house. So do the walls, the rafters, and the very bones of the place. This is how we live on. Not always in stories told or names carved in marble, but in the memory of spaces that held us, in the air we once warmed with our presence, in the buildings that keep our names tucked into their corners like forgotten notes. They do not speak these names aloud. They do not need to. They carry them the way we carry the scent of someone we love on a scarf or a phrase that reminds us of home. Quietly, without spectacle, with reverence. So if you pass a building half sunk, shuttered, hollow-eyed, do not call it empty. It is full of names that no one says, but which still echo inside like soft footsteps on old wood. The building remembers, and because it remembers, a part of the person remains. There are voices in the world that no ear is trained to hear, not because they are silent, but because they do not speak in the ways we expect. We listen for conversations in the hum of daily life, in the rise and fall of words between people, and in the way music filters through a crack in the door. But there are deeper languages, older ones, spoken not through lips or ink, but through stone, plaster, wood, and silence. There is a language spoken only by walls, not whispered, not shouted, but there, always there. In a room long since emptied of voices, there stood for walls quiet, unmoving, and yet profoundly expressive. They did not creak with protest or lean with fatigue. They stood straight, but not severe. Their paint, once bright, had faded into muted hues of time shades that light barely noticed. One corner held the ghost of a nail, where something once hung. The upper trim bore a faint crack, not from damage, but from age. And across the span of each surface, small, nearly imperceptible patterns, lines, dents, and patches of color, where sunlight had struck unevenly over the years. To the hurried eye, they said nothing, but to someone who paused, who truly listened, the walls spoke. They remembered. They remembered the laughter of a child who used to run from one end of the room to the other, breathless with some game whose rules only they understood. They remembered the hush that fell during long winter nights, when candlelight fluttered against the plaster and everyone spoke softer for reasons they couldn't explain. They remembered arguments, too muffled but sharp. They remembered the silence that came after, when no one wanted to speak first. And they remember the reconciliation, when the silence was broken not by words, but by footsteps that came close again. Walls absorb the resonance of presence. They keep what we forget. They memorize the contours of a moment, the way a shoulder brushed against them during pacing thoughts, the rhythm of a chair rocking nearby, and the hush of a hand pressed to them when someone leaned their weight, not for rest, but for grounding. And after everyone leaves, the walls do not forget. They are the keepers of the unspoken, the ones whose names are no longer spoken aloud, the keepers of lullabies hummed once and never again, of sighs released into the air when no one was looking, of things lost and things remembered and things no one else noticed. If they had a voice, if their language could be translated, it would not come in words, but in warmth, a feeling that lingers in certain corners. A temperature shift when you pass near the place where someone used to sit every morning, or when a draft comes through the crack where secrets once lived. Their grammar is made of texture. A scuffed spot by the door where a bag always swung. A curve in the woodwork where someone rested their head one too many times. The slow sag of a shelf under the weight of years. Their vocabulary is silent but vivid. Light stains, softened edges, and thumb-worn corners. Their sentences stretch not in lines, but across time, whole paragraphs held in the space between a curtain rod and the dust above a frame. We do not always know we are hearing them, but we respond. We straighten a painting that no longer hangs. We place our hand on the wall and do not know why. We pause in a room we've passed through 1,000 times, suddenly filled with a sense that something or someone is still here. Not in the ghostly sense, but in the preserved, gentle way something becomes part of the structure. In some homes, these languages remain vibrant. A kitchen where generations passed recipes not on paper, but through movements each cupboard touched in the same sequence. Each drawer opened with a familiar tug. The walls hold a choreography. They recognize it. If you move out of rhythm, the drawer sticks, or the light doesn't feel right, not as punishment, but as memory asserting itself. In other places, the language fades. Abandoned buildings speak a broken dialect still fluent, but lonely. They repeat the same phrases, the same sighs. They echo not because of emptiness, but because they miss being understood. Yet still, they speak. Even hotel rooms and offices, brief homes to transient lives, carry the beginnings of a dialect. A stain on the ceiling left by a guest who once cried through the night. A doorknob looser than the rest, turned too many times by nervous hands. Walls are fluent in our patterns. They are our secret historians. Sometimes, someone returns to a childhood home. Years after everyone is gone, they walk the hallways slowly, whispering to themselves things they cannot say aloud. And without knowing it, they begin to answer the walls in their native tongue, touching certain places, pausing at certain door frames, leaning against the kitchen counter in just the right spot. It's not nostalgia, it's conversation. The walls, of course, remember them too. There is a language spoken only by walls, and it does not ask to be translated. It only asks to be acknowledged, to be felt. You do not need to decode it. You only need to notice. Notice the hush that fills a room just before sleep takes you. When the world falls away and the only sound is the sound of stillness. Notice the way a familiar room feels different when a lamp is turned off or when a chair is empty. Notice the sensation of returning to a place after a long time, and how your body instinctively slows down as if something around you is saying, "You're home." This language is not lost. It is simply quiet. It waits for stillness to speak. And now, as you lie in your own room, surrounded by walls that know you better than you realize, listen. Not with your ears, but with your breath, with your bones, with the part of you that remembers without being told. The walls around you carry your stories, both the ones you've shared and the ones you've kept to yourself. They do not judge. They do not rush. They simply hold. They have listened to your thoughts when no one else was awake. They have echoed the rhythm of your days. They have stretched and breathed with the heat of your summers and the silence of your winters. And in their own way, they are still speaking. Their words are shaped like calm, like continuity, like understanding. They say, "You have been here. You still are. You do not have to speak to be heard." And so you rest, not in emptiness, but in quiet company. Let the language of the walls wrap around you now, not as noise, but as presence, as assurance, as something steady. Let them tell you stories not in sentences, but in stillness. Let them remind you that even in silence, you are not alone. Even in stillness, you are held. They have listened long, enough to know how to comfort you. And now they speak gently, patiently, with the steady breath of something built to last, saying nothing and everything all at once. There was a time when the gesture was automatic. The hand lifted not in thought, but in rhythm, reaching to light the lamp at dusk, to cross oneself. When passing the church gate, to wave to the same neighbor who always swept the same corner of pavement, to close a window just as the same breeze rattled through it each evening. These were not decisions, but repetitions, little acts etched into the fabric of daily life. The hands did not wonder why. They simply moved. But time passes in strange ways. One day, without a sound or a shift in season, the hands stopped rising. They no longer met the air with instinct. The gestures once sacred in their ordinariness faded, like breath on cold glass. And no one noticed the exact moment when the muscle of memory finally chose stillness over motion. Hands that once punctuated days now lie still, folded gently on laps, placed quietly on tabletops, or left hanging at one's sides like punctuation marks in a sentence no longer being spoken. Not in sadness, not in rebellion, but at rest. There is something solemn about a hand that has ceased to move, not because it is lifeless, but because it carries the weight of all the times it did move, all the cups lifted, curtains drawn, candles extinguished, and pages turned. These still hands bear the memory of 1,000 gestures, each one too small to be remembered. And yet now, in their absence, each one is felt. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about routine is that it goes unnoticed until it stops. The hand no longer rises to greet a morning that now arrives without ritual. The kettle is still, untouched. The radio remains off. The table remains set, just in case, though no one eats at it now. And the hands, those loyal executors of habit, rest in quiet rebellion against the endlessness of unremarkable days. It wasn't sudden. Habits unravel slowly, like threads from the cuff of an old sleeve. One day, you forget to do something. The next, you remember, but choose not to. And then one day, you no longer think about it at all. The hands do not mourn the shift. They were tired. Tired not from labor, but from the weight of repetition. From years of rising, reaching, ranging, apologizing, preparing, and performing. From carrying groceries and expectations. From folding laundry and emotions. From opening doors and closing conversations. So now they rest. There's a kind of dignity in it. In hands that no longer chase meaning in motion. They have made peace with their stillness. They no longer need to prove their purpose through productivity. They rest not as a sign of surrender, but as a statement of survival. A quiet refusal to move for the sake of moving. Others may see it as a loss, a giving up, but that is because they do not know the full story of these hands. They do not know how many times those hands held grief without dropping it, or joy without letting it slip. How many secrets they kept just by staying closed. How many times they trembled and still completed what was asked of them. How many doors they knocked on. How many tears they wiped away. And how many heads they held while humming lullabies into the heavy dark. Hands like these deserve their stillness. And yet, even in rest, they remain expressive. There's a language to the way they fold, to the slight curl of fingers, the softness of a palm open against cloth, the way one thumb sometimes moves slightly, as if remembering the rhythm of a forgotten task. They are not idle. They are remembering. You can almost hear the echo of their movements in the quiet, the soft clink of a teacup set down just so, the rustle of pages turned with care, the creak of an old drawer being opened, the slow grace of a photograph lifted from its envelope. The memory of motion lingers in the room like dust in the afternoon sun, floating, suspended, real. And sometimes, without reason, one hand will twitch, just once, as though it dreamed of something it used to do, as though it reached for something that was always there and then remembered it no longer needed to. There is a certain kind of wisdom in that. These hands have earned the right to be forgotten by the clock, to no longer be dictated by minutes and schedules. They rest as one rests in a home they built themselves, surrounded by the quiet evidence of their former labor. You may find them resting on the arm of a chair, lightly curled, or on a windowsill catching light. You may see them in black and white photographs, frozen mid-gesture, as if they were always moving. But now, here, in this hour of long stillness, they rest, not because they cannot move, but because they no longer have to. They have learned the rarest lesson, that sometimes the most meaningful gesture is no gesture at all, that there is reverence in restraint, that silence can hold more truth than repetition. And so, while the world continues its hurried choreography, the hands wait at the edge of it at peace. Somewhere, a clock ticks on. A kettle boils for someone else. New hands move through new habits. But here, in the room where time has softened, the old hands rest. They are not forgotten, only quiet. They still remember how to move. They still could. But for now, they simply don't. And in that stillness is a kind of triumph, subtle, sacred, and absolutely complete. Time doesn't always pass in grand gestures. Sometimes it seeps. It settles quietly. It softens its edges until the days begin to resemble each other. And in that sameness, something remarkable begins to happen. Centuries do not just pass, they settle in. They begin to live inside the things we stop noticing. The wallpaper was floral once, or perhaps geometric, or perhaps it was neither, only a soft wash of color with a border at the top, delicate and hand-painted. It's difficult to say now. The pattern has faded, browned at the corners, and peeled in a few discreet places. But it is still there, clinging, waiting, witnessing. At first, it was just wallpaper, freshly pasted, damp at the seams. The room smelled like starch and optimism, like glue and freshly mopped floors. Someone had stood in that room with a brush and a careful hand, smoothing bubbles and pressing corners flat. It was done with care, the kind of care reserved for things meant to last. And last. It did. A family lived there. Then another. And another still. The room became a hallway. Or perhaps it was always a hallway. A space passed through. Not dwelled in. Not lingered in. A transition. Like dusk. Like early spring. The kind of space people forget. They touched. But the wallpaper remembered. It remembered the weight of fingers brushing against it while someone stumbled home in the dark, too tired to find the light switch. It remembered children pressing their ears to it, listening to the sounds beyond the wall, grown-up voices in another room, whispers too quiet to understand. It remembered the moments no one else did. The century folded itself into the paper in layers. It pressed in through the sound of wartime news crackling from a radio, through the slam of a front door that never opened again, through the laughter of a child who ran in circles down the hallway until they outgrew the urge to run at all. Years became brush strokes. Memories became discolorations. Time became part of the texture. No one notices wallpaper until it's gone, or until it peels, enough to reveal something beneath. But this wallpaper refused to let go. It held on not just to the wall, but to everything. The sun had bleached it in places. Fingers had dirtied its edges. And yet, it endured. Because it wasn't just decoration. It was a witness. There had once been a calendar tacked to it, perhaps in 1924, or 1957, or 1983. The nail hole is still there. And beneath that hole, if you peel back just the right corner, you'll find the version of the wallpaper untouched by sunlight, vivid, preserved, like a secret still whispering beneath the surface. There are names written in pencil in the lower left corner, small, neat handwriting. A child's. The names are faded, but not gone. They belong to people who have likely forgotten that they ever sat there, cross-legged, scribbling dreams into the wall. But the wallpaper remembers. The wall remembers. Because buildings are not empty. They carry things. They keep what we discard. They hold what we forget. The century arrived in moments, not movements. A candle was blown out and then replaced by a gaslight. The gaslight made way for a bulb. The bulb was later dimmed with a switch someone who no longer lives installed. And all of these changes were watched, absorbed by the wallpaper. It knew how voices changed with each generation. It knew which footsteps came with anger and which with joy. It knew when someone paused beside it to cry silently, one hand on the wall for balance. It knew which night someone leaned against it to catch their breath just once. And grief never leaned there again. The wallpaper outlasted them all, not because it was strong, but because it was quiet. It did not demand attention. It was allowed to stay. Time doesn't always sweep things away. Sometimes it folds them in, folds them into fabric, into paper, into walls. And if you were to press your ear to the wallpaper now, press it gently. With intention, you might hear the century breathing, not as sound, but as presence. It would not tell you what year it is, but it would remind you that it is all of them at once. The breathless years someone waited by the phone. The joyful years someone danced alone in the hallway because they had received good news. The hollow year no one entered the house at all. They're all there, folded not in creases but in color, in the way the pattern bends toward the floor, in the way light pulls around it at different hours of the day, in the way, even now, you could peel it back and discover not damage but layers of existence. Perhaps one day someone will strip it, not in cruelty, but in necessity. And perhaps they will pause as it pulls away, noticing the mark it left behind not just on the wall, but in the room's memory. Perhaps they'll wonder what stories lived inside its silence, what moments it witnessed that no one else remembers, what small things mattered once, folded carefully between fiber and paste. And if they're gentle and curious and slow enough not to rush the task, they might feel the hush of a century rising softly into the air. Like dust illuminated in a shaft of window light, it will not speak in words, but it will be heard, because the wallpaper was never just wallpaper. It was archived. It was quiet testimony. It was the place where time curled up, made itself small, and stayed. And so the century remains not gone, but resting, not erased, but gently folded away, like a letter never sent, or a lullaby remembered only by the walls. There is a kind of silence that belongs only to places meant for movement. Airports at midnight, bus depots long after the last route. And then, there is the train station with no rivals. It still stands. This station, with its clock that ticks whether or not anyone is listening. The benches are lined in perfect rows, polished by time and the memory of passengers who once sat, their luggage tucked beneath their knees, their eyes watching for a distant glint of light that meant someone was coming. But now, the station waits quietly unmoving. No trains pulling, no conductors step down, no voices crackle through the overhead speaker announcing arrivals from elsewhere. The tracks stretch out like question marks, vanishing into a landscape that no longer promises return. They are polished only by wind and the slow whisper of time. And yet, nothing has been abandoned. The windows are cleaned every Tuesday, whether or not anyone smudges them. The station master, whose name no one remembers anymore, still walks the length of the platform each morning with a clipboard and a pen that never runs dry. He writes things down, imagined times, phantom delays, possible arrivals. His schedule is meticulous, though it has not changed in years. Some say he is waiting for a specific train to final one, or perhaps the first. Others say he simply cannot leave a post he was once proud to hold. But more often than not, he does not speak at all, only nods to the pigeons nesting in the iron rafters and listens for a sound that never quite arrives. The clock above the main arch still works. It ticks and talks and circles, not for function, but for form. Time continues here, but in loops rather than lines. It is not linear at the station with no rivals. It is a carousel of mornings that feel like echoes and evenings that never quite resolve. Time is something you notice only when the light shifts across the stone floor tiles, inch by inch, and you realize that the day has changed its angle. The station holds within it a breath that never finishes. It is the feeling you get just before someone enters the room. That pause between footsteps on gravel and the turning of a knob. But in this station, the pause stretches on forever. It is filled with imagined footsteps and remembered greetings. Luggage never lifted. Hugs were never given. Names never called out into the dusty air. Still, there is beauty. A coat hangs on the peg near the ticket booth. It has not moved in years, but it sways ever so slightly when the wind finds its way through the narrow gaps in the wooden walls. Thus motes rise and fall like quiet confetti. A half-read newspaper lies open on a bench, its headline faded, but legible something about rain on a Tuesday long past. The waiting room still smells faintly of coffee and varnished wood, like memory held in a bottle. Sometimes, children wander in from the nearby village, daring each other to step onto the platform or sit on the empty luggage cart. They whisper and giggle, afraid not of ghosts but of waking something to still. The station does not scold them. It simply watches, and when they leave, their small hands pressing smudges onto the clean glass, the building holds onto the warmth they left behind, like a parent remembering a child's touch. Once, a single bird flew in through the open doorway and perched on the arrival's board. It stayed there for a long while, as though trying to read the invisible schedule. Then it flew away, as quietly as it came. The station keeper marked its arrival in his notebook under a column labeled unscheduled. The notebook, by now, is full of similar entries. Afternoon breezed through the east window. Sunlight struck the brass bell at 3:17. Footsteps heard on the platform, no visible source. He writes them down not out of duty, but reverence. as though each small occurrence might one day explain why the train stopped coming or why they might return. You would think a place like this would become forgotten, that it would crumble or fade or be overtaken by ivy and silence. But the station endures, not because it must, but because it chooses to. There is a quiet dignity in that, a grace in remaining whole, even when the world has stopped asking you to be. Sometimes, fog rolls in from the fields and settles around the tracks like a sleeping animal. The platform becomes a dreamscape. The rails disappear into gray. On those days, even the station master looks up with a little more attention, as though expecting something or someone might materialize. But nothing ever does. And yet, the benches remain polished. The lanterns are lit at dusk. The whistle that once signaled an oncoming train is tested once a month, its sound echoing through space like a question no one remembers how to answer. This place is not sad, though it is steeped in longing. Longing not for movement, but for meaning, for a reason to open its doors wider, for the sound of footsteps running to meet someone, for the echo of names called out with joy or relief or impatience. But in the absence of those things, the station does not fall into despair. It simply waits with the patience of stone and the hopefulness of rails still aligned. Perhaps that is its purpose now, not to receive, not to send, but to hold space, to remain ready, to honor the idea that something could arrive, even if it never does. People from the surrounding countryside sometimes come to the station not to catch a train, but to sit. They bring books or thermoses of tea. They sit quietly on the benches and watch the sky change color through the high windows. Some come to remember people who once traveled through. Others come to forget. The station offers both. No one is turned away, though no one is formally welcomed either. It is simply there. A place where arrivals no longer happen, but where presence still matters. Where the architecture of waiting has become its form of meaning. There is a lesson in the quietness of the place, that not all waiting is wasted, that even in the absence, there is structure, intention, care. The station reminds us that not everything arrives when or how we expect it to, and that sometimes the pause itself is the point. That presence can be enough. And if one day a train does arrive, if a whistle cries out in the distance, and the ground begins to tremble with approach, the station will not be surprised. It will be ready. It has always been ready. But even if the day never comes, the station will not have been empty. It will have held every possible arrival within itself. It will have welcomed every silence as though it were a guest. It will have remained watchful, steady, open. Not all destinations require movement. Some are found in stillness. And some stations are built not for arrival or departure, but to show us how to wait with grace, with care, and with hope that hums quietly, like tracks under a sleeping sky. There is a silence peculiar to places that once thrummed with small expectations. The post office stood as it always had, modest in size, its red brick fouet chipped from weather and years, its wooden sign faded by sun and neglect. A single dusty window framed the inside, catching afternoon light that slanted across a counter long untouched. There were no footsteps in the gravel outside, no chime of the doorbell announcing a visitor. Only stillness and the ticking of an unseen clock in the back room, marking hours that no longer belonged to anyone. Once, this was a place of heartbeats hidden in envelopes, of hands that trembled slightly as they passed, notes across the counter, of postcards from cities never visited, and parcels bound in string, wrapped with care and secret urgency. Once, the room was alive with voices asking, "Has anything come for me today?" As if hope could be packed in paper and delivered with a stamp. Once, the postmaster would nod gently, sometimes with a smile, sometimes with a sorrow to practice to show. Now, the only sound was the echo of memory in a hollow space behind the counter. A shelf of pigeonholes still stood, labeled with names that had once meant something. Mrs. Langley, Pichu, Samantha from the Blue House. Some labels had curled and yellowed at the edges, barely legible. Others remained crisp, their ink outliving the people they served. Letters unclaimed, unopened, sat quietly inside them, like forgotten voices folded up tight. No one came for them. The letters waited anyway, The building itself had adjusted to the quiet. The floorboards no longer creaked in anticipation, only in memory. The windows didn't expect to be clean. The hanging lamp, dust-covered, swayed slightly on occasion when a breeze moved through a broken seal. Even the wooden chair behind the counter had learned to hold its weight without complaint. But the room remembered. It remembered hands warmed from mugs of tea waiting to send thank you cards. It remembered lovers who hesitated just a moment too long before slipping a letter into the outgoing slot. It remembered telegrams with too few words that said too much. It remembered the man who wrote to a daughter who never wrote back, and the boy who sent holiday cards to soldiers he never met. It remembered handwriting that was tidy, and handwriting that looked like it had run ahead of the pen. Even the bags in the back room, once filled with stamps and string, seemed to hum with these recollections. And yet, the door stayed closed. Mail arrived on occasion. The courier still came every third Wednesday. Like a ritual no one had canceled. He didn't knock. He simply slid the day's offering through the chute and left again. Bootprints pressed in a straight line down the dusty path. Some letters landed with soft, private thuds. Some lay askew beneath the shelves. None were claimed. Somewhere, someone still addressed them. Perhaps not realizing the office had gone quiet. Perhaps knowing and sending the letter anyway, not for the delivery, but for the saying. There is a kind of bravery in sending something off into silence. And so, the letters continued to arrive. Love letters sent too late. Apologies offered without expectation. News of births, even as the intended recipient had long since passed. Holiday greetings that would sit unopened past the next season and the next. Receipts of lives lived elsewhere, still trying to reach someone who had once cared. What becomes of words with no readers? They rest in the pigeonholes, in the drawers, in the corners of the room. They rest, but they do not vanish. Paper yellows, ink fades, but the message is the weight of what was felt, written, and sent lingers in the fibers. The building has become a reliquary of quiet communication, an archive of human longing pressed into pages, and the postmaster gone. Perhaps, or maybe he still comes back from time to time, lingering in the doorway without entering. Maybe he dreams of the letters and wakes up with the feel of an envelope still resting in his palm. Or perhaps, in some way that escapes explanation, the postmaster has become part of the building itself, its breath, its memory, its endless waiting. A chair sits behind the counter, pushed slightly askew. On the table rests a cup, dry and faintly stained. The calendar is still turned to a month many years past, when someone last bothered to count the days. A pen lies uncapped beside a notebook that holds only 3 words. No one came. But absence is not the same as emptiness, because in this place, the ghosts are gentle. They come in the form of cursive script and postage stamps. They whisper from behind sealed flaps and folded paper. Their presence is quiet, but it fills the room like dust and sunlight. And the post office does not resent being forgotten. It knows that it served its purpose, that it once carried joy, worry, and hope across miles. Now it simply keeps them, and perhaps that's enough. Perhaps there is meaning in being a vessel, even when no one returns to draw from it. Perhaps it is sacred to guard what others left behind. Perhaps the walls feel a quiet pride, knowing they held secrets not meant to be shared beyond the address on the envelope. Outside, the world continues. Children grow up never knowing the weight of a letter in hand. People press buttons and send their words in blinking lights, never folding paper, never licking a stamp. The world has moved on. But this place, this post office remains. It waits, not out of expectation, but out of purpose. The door may stay shut, the dust may gather, but inside, the letters still whisper. They speak of love and distance, of things said and unsaid. They speak of afternoons when someone believed enough to write. And in that belief, in that act of faith that the words mattered, something sacred was created. A sacredness that lingers even now, in the silence, in the stillness. In the post office where no one comes, the shelves still hold them, and that is enough. There are places built not to rush, but to remember. Quiet buildings where footsteps echo faintly across polished floors, and silence hangs like a fine mist in the air, not oppressive, but reverent. In these places, light falls softly from high windows, tracing delicate lines across display cases, illuminating fragments of what once was. These are the museum's silent keepers of the past, where time, impossibly, has been asked to stay still. In these rooms, time lives behind glass. It breathes no longer, but it is not forgotten. It has been arranged, cataloged, labeled, and gently placed under protection. A cracked bowl with faded glaze, a pair of worn shoes, a clock that will never tick again. Time has been distilled here, not lost, but preserved in its quietest, most fragile forms. The glass itself is thin, sometimes nearly invisible. It creates the illusion that nothing separates you from the object it protects, but that illusion is only partial, because there is always something between the viewer and the past, not just the pain, but the passage. The years that stretch like quiet corridors behind every object, full of voices you can't quite hear and lives you can't quite touch. Each exhibit is a breath that someone once took, a moment someone once lived and then left behind. The glass doesn't just preserve the item, it preserves the gap. It holds the space between what was and what is. In doing so, it invites you not just to observe, but to listen closely to the stillness. There is a stillness unique to museums. It is not the stillness of absence, but of deep presence. A stillness that says, look, this mattered once. This still matters now. And so you walk slowly, not because you are told to, but because something in you responds to the hush. You find your pace softening, your breath lengthening, and your voice retreating into your chest. Even thoughts seem to quiet, as if not to disturb the layers of meaning resting behind each case. In one corner sits a faded letter, its ink softened to a shade between blue and gray. The handwriting slants to the right, full of urgency and warmth. It was meant for someone, a friend, a lover, a stranger whose name was once known, but now is simply marked on a placard below. The letter is unreadable now, its edges brown, but still, it radiates. You don't need to read the words to understand their weight. The glass holds them steady and lets you feel the echo of their delivery. Elsewhere, there is a doll missing an arm, its fabric body worn through at the chest. It once belonged to a child whose name is not recorded, but still, behind the glass, it speaks, not with words, but with presence. You can imagine the grip of a small hand, the way it might have been tucked under a blanket, and the soft lullabies it might have heard before sleep. Now it rests, finally still, its final role to be remembered. These items are not grand, not royal crowns or famous swords. They are quieter things, a spoon, a button, a diary with only a few pages filled. But in their quietness lies their truth. They tell the story of ordinary Tom, of lives not written in books but lived in kitchens, bedrooms, and fields. The glass does not glorify them, it honors them. Some cases hold things older than memory, fossils, perhaps, or shards of clay shaped by hands that never imagined glass, or museums, or anything beyond their firelight. These pieces carry the weight of centuries. Their silence is deeper. When you stand before them, you feel small but not insignificant. You feel part of the same thread, woven loosely but unbroken, stretching back to those ancient fingers that shape the earth and forward to your hand resting on the glass. The caretakers of these places, curators, archivists, and conservators, understand that time is both delicate and defiant. They do not control it, they simply guide its presence. They dust it gently, adjust the lights, and ensure the glass remains clean and clear. They are keepers of stillness, protectors of fragile echoes. They know that a crack in the glass could let time escape again, or worse, let the present blur what once was. Even the air inside a museum feels different, cooler, quieter, as though it has agreed to pause, as though it understands that breath must be taken more gently here, that noise must be softened, and that movement must be mindful. You do not run in a museum. You do not shout. You walk. You look. You listen for things that no longer make a sound. Outside, time rushes on. Buses groan past. Phones vibrate. Leaves fall, rot, and are replaced. But inside the museum, the moment lingers. The seconds. A broken watch in a case says 3:12, and it will always say 3:12. A child's shoe will always be small. A faded map will always show a border that no longer exists. The world may change, but behind the glass, something always stays the same. You begin to wonder if you, too, are being held in glass, just for a moment. Your reflection overlaps with the item behind the case, your eyes and a helmet, your hand and a spoon, your breath fogging ever so slightly on the pane. There is no true barrier between you and what was. Only the quiet agreement that time will not be touched directly. That to see is enough. That to remember is the act. Some leave notes and guest books near the exit. Thank you. Beautiful. I felt something I didn't expect. These words become their kind of artifact, fresh offerings to the ancient, new voices speaking into old halls. The museum holds them too, in its way. Not behind glass, but in spirit. Because time doesn't just live in what is displayed. It also lives in what is felt. And when you leave, blinking into the brightness of the present, you carry something with you. A soft layer of stillness. A quiet respect. A new attention to small things. You see a pebble on the ground and think of how it might one day be in a case. You fold an old letter more gently. You place a worn object on a shelf, not because you are done with it, but because you are beginning to see it differently. Time continues. It always will. But now, a part of you walks more slowly, holds more carefully, because you have seen how time looks when it's held in glass, how delicate, how silent, how profound. And you understand now that everything, given patience and care, can become a memory worth preserving. Even this moment, as you drift towards sleep, is held in a kind of invisible glass. Not to be frozen, but to be honored. A moment of quiet, a breath, a thought. Yours. Safe. Still. Remembered. The bells rang with a purpose, as they always had, deep and resonant. Their sound rolled outward in layers, each toll stitched with centuries of intention. The iron clappers struck like echoes of tradition, wrapped in memory and ritual, calling the faithful, marking time, announcing births, deaths, and every sacred hour in between. The churches remained steadfast, their towers still standing like sentinels above a shifting earth, and the bells still rang from within them. But the air no longer seemed to care. Once, their sound could stir the soul. Once, people would pause mid-step, turn their faces toward the source, remove hats, heads, or make the sign of the cross. Once, the sound carried meaning divine, communal, comforting. It drifted through open windows and settled in kitchens and parlors, where it became part of the rhythm of daily life. A bell at noon reminded people to eat. A bell at 6 called them to evening prayer. A bell at midnight sent its hush across the land like a velvet curtain pulled gently closed. But now, the tolling passed unnoticed. It moved through the streets like wind that had forgotten how to feel. The air had grown thick with other sounds, cars rushing by without patience, televisions muttering to empty rooms, machines humming into exhaustion, people shouting into their devices. The bell's ancient tones were lost in that blur, diluted, reduced to a vibration, too soft to stir what it once could. And so the bells rang on, faithfully, even as the world forgot to listen. Inside one of the churches, the rope still hung like weary arms stretched down from heaven. A single figure stood there most days, pulling gently, reverently, with hands that knew the movement by heart. He didn't pull for an audience. He didn't pull for attention. He rang the bells because that was what had always been done, and some things deserved to continue simply because they had once meant something sacred. When the bells rang, he imagined their sound climbing the belfry, brushing against stone, and stepping out into the world like breath into winter. He imagined the notes seeking ears the way a letter seeks a reader. But even he knew that most people no longer heard them. He could see it in the faces of those who passed by, eyes cast downward, bodies wrapped in distraction. The bells reached them, yes, but only as a distant murmur, Like an old story overheard but not understood, the air itself had changed. There was a time when air held the weight of sound differently. Hannah carried it as if it mattered. When the bell as toll would ripple through the mist of morning and stir the birds from their nests, cause dogs to lift their heads, and inspire children to ask questions. But now, the air moved faster. It raced. It buzzed with static and pressure. It no longer cradled sound. It merely let it pass. And yet, the churches remained. Their stones bore the wear of wind and rain, but still stood tall, still traced the sky with their spires. Inside, pews gathered dust, but stood in their rows like faithful congregants who had simply forgotten how to speak. Candles burned quietly in alcoves, flickering not in devotion, but in memory of it. The scent of wax and wood and silence clung to every crevice. In the back, behind the altar, a small door led to the tower. The steps curled upward like a question without an answer, and if you followed them, if you made the climb past pigeon nests and shadows, you reached the heart of the sound, the bells themselves, suspended in stillness until moved. Some bore inscriptions, names long forgotten, dates etched in rusted script, prayers cast into metal. To stand there, beside the bell, was to feel its weight not just in mass, but in meaning. These were not just objects. They were declarations. Their ringing was not meant to be noise, but notice, the start of something, the ending of something else, a marking of time. Yes, but also a call to remember, to gather, to feel. But down below, in the square, people passed by without pause. The bells rang overhead and fell like petals, unnoticed. Once, lovers might have kissed beneath the ringing, believing it to be a sign. Once, a child might have counted each peal as if counting blessings. Once, the elderly might have closed their eyes and remembered the voices of those long gone, heard again in the trembling tone of the bell. Now, only the wind answered, and even then, only barely. In winter, snow would muffle the bells further, blanketing sound as gently as it blanketed rooftops. In summer, the heat would stretch the tones, make them thinner, distant, like something remembered from childhood. In the rain, the bells would echo strangely less like a song, and more like a question sent out into a world too busy to reply it still. The bells did not protest. They rang without expectation. They rang for the sake of the act itself, as if simply ringing could keep the shape of something once cherished, once central, now forgotten. As if devotion could be maintained even in the absence. The bell ringer knew this. He no longer checked the square to see who listened. He no longer asked children if they had heard. He simply rang. His arms moved with slow familiarity, like a ritual remembered in the body if not the mind. And when he let go of the rope and the bell's voice moved outward, he would close his eyes not to listen, but to feel. The vibration passed through the tower, into the stone, into the wooden beams, and maybe, just maybe, into the sky. The air didn't answer, but perhaps it carried the memory somewhere. Perhaps across the hills, someone paused for a reason they couldn't name. Perhaps far off, a man looked up from his book and felt an ache without a source. Perhaps a bird shifted direction mid-flight, or a sleeping infant smiled faintly in its cradle. Perhaps the sound mattered even when it was no longer heard. After all, bells have always spoken into languages, one for the ear and one for the soul. And though the air may no longer carry the sound in the old, reverent way, the soul still remembers. Somewhere deep, somewhere hidden beneath the clamor of the present world, the soul still knows what bells mean. They mean pause. They mean notice this. They mean you are not alone. They mean something sacred still. And so, even if the air does not notice, even if the streets remain indifferent, even if the passersby do not look up, the churches ring their bells, not out of habit, but out of hope. A quiet, defiant hope that meaning persists even when drowned. That sound is still sound, even in silence. That time marked well is never wasted, even when it falls into the air that doesn't notice, even when no one listens. Even then, there was a time when streets pulsed with purpose. Their paths were arrows, always pointing forward, always measuring worth by momentum. Cars rushed, people marched, deadlines loomed behind every corner. The world moved as if being still were a kind of failure. Streets were not places to be, they were places to pass through. A means, never a moment. But then, quietly and without announcement, something shifted. The streets, those arteries of movement, lost their urgency. They softened, slowed. The traffic lights still blinked their mechanical rhythm, but no one watched them closely anymore. Horns grew quiet. Footsteps lost their chase. The streets, once chiseled by direction, became aimless. Or maybe they had always been, and people had simply forgotten how to notice. Now, the streets led nowhere urgent, and everyone adjusted accordingly. You could walk down a street for hours without feeling late. You could stop in the middle of it, not because you needed to tie a shoe or check a message, but because the sun was sitting just right on the pavement and your shadow stretched out, like it was trying to remember you. People began to meander. They wandered not because they were lost, but because they had remembered how. Children played with sticks instead of screens. Elderly couples walked side by side, not to exercise but to remember what the world sounded like without speed. In the windows along those streets, curtains no longer rushed to close or open. They swayed gently, like they, too, had stepped back from obligation. Flowers bloomed in crooked pots, not arranged with aesthetic purpose, but grown with the patient messiness of people who had stopped rushing to tidy up everything that lived. There were benches that no longer marked waiting points but resting places. Strangers sat side by side and didn't always speak. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was respectful, almost holy. A shared acknowledgement that nothing was pressing. Shops stayed open later, but only because the owners were in no hurry to go home. Or perhaps because home had extended itself into every part of their day. A tailor sat cross-legged at the entrance to his store, sewing slowly, not glancing at a clock. A woman who sold books began reading them again out loud to whoever passed and paused. Mailboxes filled more slowly. Letters, when they arrived, carried less urgency and more texture. No one apologized for late replies anymore. No one asked, "Did you get my message?" Because even if you hadn't, it could wait. Everything could wait. Even time walked those streets with softer shoes. You could feel it around you, not galloping, but strolling. It whispered in rustling leaves, and the creak of shop signs swaying gently in the breeze. It hummed in puddles reflecting skies that didn't need to be chased or outrun. There were signs still, of course, arrows and warnings and numbered streets. But people looked at them differently, not as orders, but as suggestions. Turn here. If you like, go straight, or don't. Stay a while at this corner. The world won't miss you for an hour. Cafes stopped printing specials and instead served whatever felt right. One day, it was spiced bread and apricot tea. The next, just a warm bowl of something that had been simmering since morning. People came, not for what they expected, but for the space that expected nothing of them. The street musicians played longer now, not for coins, but for themselves. Their songs weren't loud or sharp. They were drawn out, meandering tunes that looped like thought. People stood to listen, not out of obligation, but because it felt right to linger where beauty had stopped to rest. And the buildings changed, too, not in form, but in feeling. Once towering, rushed monoliths of industry, they now stood like aging relatives, weathered, reliable, and softer than before. Vines crawled without being trimmed. Windows stayed open longer. Some rooftops gathered chairs and conversations that lasted past dusk. Pigeons walked the sidewalks like they owned them. And maybe they did. No one hurried them. No one scattered them with impatience. Even the stray cats moved more slowly, yawning in sunbeams, strolling through alleys that no longer echoed with haste. There were fewer alarms, fewer alerts. The silence filled in the spaces where urgency used to live. And that silence, once terrifying, had grown gentle, familiar, like a friend who knows when to be quiet with you. Of course, the world hadn't stopped. People still had jobs, still fed children, still repaired things that broke. But they did so with more intention, less speed. They allowed themselves the luxury of breathing between tasks. A delivery arrived a day late, and no one cursed. A meeting started 15 minutes behind, and no one checked their watch. Instead, they shared a story about the rain, or the neighbor's cat, or the way the moon had looked last night. Far too large for its good, new routes formed along the old roads. Not shortcuts, never that, but scenic detours, favored corners, and forgotten alleys that people begin rediscovering as places worth knowing. Some people walked barefoot just to feel the warmth of the world again. Some sketched the cracks in the pavement as though they held stories. Some sat at bus stops not to ride, but to observe the symphony of nothing happening urgently. And at night, the streets did not empty in a panic or in fear of what tomorrow demanded. They softened into rest. Lights dimmed slowly. Porch lanterns glowed like quiet sentinels. The sounds of late conversations drifted from open windows. No one whispered, "I should go." Because where was there to rush to? The cities adjusted. Maps became less about navigation and more about curiosity. People asked, "What's down this way?" and followed the question without needing a reason. There were fewer goals and more gentle arrivals. Sometimes at a park, sometimes at a river, sometimes in the middle of the road where a new friend stood waiting, or a dog rolled lazily in the dirt. Some resisted at first. They clenched their lists, their schedules, their color-coded lives. But even they, eventually, felt the rhythm shift beneath them. Their calendar pages stopped turning. Their reminders faded like chalk in the rain. And one day, they found themselves walking too slower, softer toward nowhere urgent. No one missed the old pace, though they remembered it, like a childhood illness or a forgotten winter. They spoke of it either in the past tense, like something endured. "Remember when we used to run for everything?" they'd ask, shaking their heads gently, marveling at how fast they used to breathe. Even grief slowed down. It sat longer. It didn't sting like it used to. Loss had space now. Space to weep, to reflect, to honor. There was time to remember well. Time to write the names, to light the candles, to carry the stories. The streets did not mourn the urgency. They seemed relieved. You could see it in the way their lines cracked and curled like smiles, in the way flowers grew in gutters, in the way sunlight touched the stone without hurry, lingering long after shadows arrived. This was not utopia. It was not perfect. It was simply different. A world reshaped by a slower breath. And in that breath, something opened. Not just time, but tenderness. A tenderness for the everyday. For the way leaves dance without reason. For the way strangers hold doors open a little longer. For the way a dog pauses at every scent, and its human no longer pulls the leash tight. And so, the streets that once rushed toward a destination now welcomed dwelling. They offered not answers, but questions. Not direction, but discovery. Not escape, but presence. No one asked, "What time is it?" Instead, they asked, "How does this moment feel?" And they listened. And they stayed. And they walked the streets that led nowhere, urgent, and found, perhaps, everything they'd been too busy to notice before. There is a particular kind of nostalgia that clings not to events or people, but to the way fabric falls on a shoulder, the shape of a collar, or the buttoning of something once common and now unfamiliar. In one quiet corner of the world, perhaps a town not far from your own, or perhaps a memory you've never had but still recognize there is a woman who dresses each day, in the style of decades no longer named in conversation. Her skirt sways when she walks, stitched in a pattern last seen on dance floors where radios once played swing music. In scratchy mono, her blouses button up to the neck, framed with lace that would have been fashionable in a year remembered only by those who've stopped counting. Hats still sit atop her head, not with irony, not as a costume, but with the dignity of ritual. Gloves, too. She wears them not to keep warm, but because hands were once dressed before they were offered. She does not wear these clothes to be seen. In fact, she lives quietly. But when she steps outside to tend to the roses or to fetch a small parcel from the post office, the world seems to slow for just a moment, unsure of what era it's wandered into. People notice, and they don't. Some smile, not knowing why. Children sometimes stare, not with confusion, but with that instinctive reverence reserved for things rare and carefully kept. Inside her home, the years have stacked like old postcards. Her wardrobe is a timeline of texture, wool from a war decade, silk from a time when ships still crossed oceans just for letters, dotted cotton from summers before air conditioning, when fans hummed and hems were pressed with patience. There are shoes polished to a shine, even though they have not been worn to a dance in decades. There are coats with waistlines and purpose. There are brooches shaped like birds and lockets that still hold the same small photograph. She is not old enough to have lived through all the times her clothing recalls, but she remembers them anyway, not in facts, but in feelings. She wears the memory of people she's never met, the way a shoulder pad once meant readiness, the way a hemline once meant rebellion. She carries all of it not as a burden, but as an inheritance. In her closet, everything has a story, not because someone told her one, but because time stitched meaning into every seam. A blue wool jacket with faded lining reminds her of winter mornings in a town square that smelled of bread and wood smoke. A gingham dress, long out of style, calls to mind porch swings and the sound of screen doors. She is not sure if these are real memories or ones the clothes themselves whisper when she slips them on, but she does not question it. Every morning is a ritual. She rises, moves slowly, and selects not what is new, but what is necessary for the spirit of the day. Some days require the quiet comfort of thick corduroy. Others call for the cool simplicity of linen. On rare occasions, there is satin, and she wears it with the solemnity of memory, even if only to sit and read beside the window. She does not save clothes for occasions. Every day is its own occasion. Outside, the world moves on. New fashion arrives like weather fast, bright, and often quickly gone. But she does not follow trends. She follows stories, and the stories she wears do not expire. They are reread each time a button is fastened or a scarf is knotted just so. They are worn not for fashion, but for presence, for the way a person can inhabit time instead of merely passing through it. She keeps a small notebook in her dresser drawer. In it, she writes descriptions not of her outfits, but of the days lived in them. Rainy Tuesday, wore green tweed, read old letters, felt the past near, or sunlight on the garden wall. Wore the navy coat with the silver clasp, smelled lavender in the hallway, thought of no one in particular. It is a quiet archive, not meant to be shared, but full of meaning nonetheless. Sometimes, she walks to the park and sits on a bench, hands folded in her lap, watching people pass. They rarely stop, but often glance back. There is something magnetic about the sincerity with which she occupies herself. She does not fidget. She does not scroll. She simply sits, as people once did, allowing the day to shape itself around her. In the evenings, she irons dots slowly, carefully, not because she must, but because it feels like a way of tending to something larger than fabric. She mends 2 small stitches with tiny needles, a thread here, a seam there. Her fingers move as though remembering, not just doing. In her hands, a torn cuff becomes not broken, but loved. She often hums as she works songs no one plays on the radio anymore, tunes that feel like lullabies for the past. And in these moments, the house itself seems to relax. The curtains fall softer. The air grows warmer. Even the creak of the floorboard near the kitchen seems more forgiving. She is not trying to go backward. She does not long for a better time. She knows full well the decades she wore were not all kind. But she honors them, not their politics or their cruelties, but their textures, their small, unspoken gestures. The way people used to carry handkerchiefs. The way a coat could be both armor and invitation. The way clothing once told stories not just about who someone was, but about what they hoped to be. On her bookshelf, there are no fashion magazines, only novels worn at the corners, their pages soft from being read again and again. She often reads the same sentence twice, just to feel the shape of it. She believes that repetition is not the enemy of meaning, but its deepening. Some neighbors wonder if she is lonely, but loneliness is not what fills the silence of her home. Rather, it is presence. A full, considered attention to things others overlook. The brushing of lint, the folding of handkerchiefs, the smell of woolen rain, the hum of the kettle at precisely 4 o'clock. If you ask her why she dresses the way she does, she might pause before answering, not because she is unsure, but because the answer is not simple. She might say, softly, because someone should remember, or perhaps, because the clothes remember me, or, more likely, she would smile and change the subject, not out of secrecy, but because some things do not need to be explained. Once, during a rare visit to a crowded place, someone asked her if she was in costume. She laughed not unkindly and said, "No, I just never stopped dressing." It was not meant to be profound, but it lingered in the air like perfume. She knows, of course, that most people move with the current, that fashion, like time, pushes forward. But she also knows that some things are worth standing still for. That to wear the past is not to deny the present, but to carry it with greater care. To feel the weight of history not as a burden, but as something woven thread by thread into who we are. And so, each day, she rises. She brushes her hair. She buttons a blouse. She selects a brooch. She steps out into a world that no longer notices seams or stitching. But she notices, and she walks. Her shadow shaped by decades that no longer speak loudly, but would still whisper if you listen closely. She is not trying to make a statement. She is living a sentence, one carefully constructed, quietly spoken, gently repeated, a sentence that began long ago and continues now unfolding with each sleeve, each pleat, each carefully chosen thread. There are kitchens that smell of memory more than spice, where the walls remember touch, where the oven holds ghosts, and where the counters are worn smooth from years of quiet alchemy. And in one such kitchen, perhaps yours or someone's grandmother's, no recipe books are cluttering the shelves, no cards with neat handwriting, no framed family instructions pinned to the wall. And yet, the meals come out just right, because the recipes live not on paper, but in the heart. It begins with hands, not measuring cups or timers, but hands that move with quiet certainty, reaching instinctively for flour, for oil, for just the right pinch of salt. These are hands that were once learned by watching, that once stood on tiptoes to peer over countertops, wide-eyed as dough was rolled or broth stirred. These are hands that remember not in numbers, but in feeling, a half handful, a splash, until it smells right, until it feels like Sunday. You cannot write it down. The recipe is not a list. It is a memory, layered and alive. The taste of early mornings when the house was cold and the stove burned warm. The sound of onions meeting hot oil. The sharp hiss followed by a soft lull. The shape of a mother's back, moving gently from sink to pot to pan. The soft hum of a song with no name, only melody, only love. There is a dish for sorrow. There is a dish for joy. There is a dish for visitors and another for when no one is coming. They are not titled. No formal instructions exist. But the moment you begin, the body remembers. Not because you studied, but because you lived it. And it's more than food. It's how long you knead the dough before it tells you it's ready. It asks the way you wrap the bread in a clean towel so it doesn't tea cold quickly. It's knowing which spoon to use, not because it's better, but because it's the one she always used. It's the timing of stirring while looking out the window, the way the light falls across the counter in late afternoon, and the feel of the kettle's handle warming your palm at just the right moment. There's no recipe for that. And so, the kitchen becomes a place of quiet ceremony, not precise, but holy, not repeatable, but intimate. Meals prepared not with direction, but by remembering. The passing of this kind of knowledge is subtle. It happens when a child is invited to taste the sauce with the back of the spoon, when a teenager is asked to fetch the good pan, when an apron is tied gently around someone else's waist, not to teach, but to include. There are no lessons, only moments, and moments, repeated often enough, become muscle memory. And muscle memory becomes a kind of reverence, long after the hands that first taught are gone. The gestures remain. You find yourself patting the dough just as she did, tapping the side of the pot flipping the bread with a wrist flick you never consciously learned. And when someone asks, "How did you make this?" you hesitate because there is no real answer. You just did. You remember, not with the mind, but with the body. These recipes, these remembered rituals, are more than cooking. They are acts of preservation. They keep people alive in taste, in scent, and in texture. You may forget the sound of her voice, but you remember the way she dusted cinnamon over the top. You may forget the last thing he said, but your hands fold the dumplings exactly as his did, even without trying. In the moment of making, they are beside you, not as a ghost, but as a rhythm, a presence in the palm, a warmth at your back. And when you pass these meals along, when you cook for someone else without needing to look at a page, you are not sharing food. You are sharing memory. There's a kind of poetry in a meal that has no written record, a defiance of erasure, a quiet rebellion against forgetting, a refusal to let love disappear just because it wasn't documented, because love does not needing to exist. Some grandmothers never wrote down a single recipe. Some fathers cooked only with what was at hand. There are aunties and uncles, neighbors and friends who prepared magic from scraps and silence. Their wisdom lives on not in books, but in the hands of those who watched, who listened, and who felt. And perhaps the food doesn't taste quite the same now. Maybe something is missing. Maybe the stove is different, or the ingredients are less fresh. But that's not what matters. What matters is the memory that rises with the steam, the way you stir, and for just a second, you are 5 years old again, peeking from the corner of the room. The way the smell in the kitchen makes you close your eyes, and a name long gone appears in your chest, unspoken, but deeply felt. The way a simple dish, humble and unremarkable to outsiders, feels like a ceremony you were chosen to carry forward. No paper holds this. No list of instructions can replicate it, because it isn't about the food alone. It's about the moment, about the intention, about the breath you take before beginning, the way you taste and say quietly, almost, knowing something and you will adjust it without needing to know why. You do it because you were loved that way. And love, once fed, does not forget. Someday, someone will watch you cook and not realize they are learning. They will mimic the way you stir or how you test the dough by touch. They will grow older and find themselves preparing the same meal without understanding how they remember. And they will, because the memory is not stored in the mind, but in motion, in the way your fingers shape the edges, in the tilt of the pan, in the feeling that something is just right. And maybe one day, someone will ask them, "Do you have a recipe for this?" And they will smile, a little unsure, and say, "I don't know. I just remember how it's supposed to feel." And that will be enough. There is a particular kind of quiet that comes not from silence, but from sound that never resolves. A hum, a whisper, a low, grainy hiss, the sound of a radio left tuned to nothing, or perhaps tuned to everything all at once. Not music, not voice, not even a signal, just the quiet fuzz of something trying, endlessly, to reach out and find connection. It is the sound of searching that has forgotten what it was looking for. In some corners of forgotten homes or long-disused rooms, there are radios that are still on. Their small dials remain lit, their knobs untouched for years. Dust has settled in soft blankets over the speakers. But still, the sound comes, faint, persistent. The static that once filled a pause between stations has become the station itself. Someone once tuned the dial with care, a wrist turned with purpose, searching for a voice, a song, a match between the present moment and whatever was drifting through the air. Perhaps it was news. Perhaps it was a melody that once made someone sing aloud, alone in the kitchen. Perhaps it was the sound of a loved one's voice traveling across great distances, transformed into waves, then into breath again. But now, the hand that once tuned it is gone, or simply no longer listening, and the radio continues, whispering in its language of lost signals. It doesn't ask to be turned off. It doesn't complain. It simply remains, softly alive, a ghost made of sound. This static is not empty. If you listen closely, It's full of movement rivers of invisible electricity, rising and falling like the tide, bursts and lulls, flecks of imagined words. It's easy, especially in the quiet of the night, to think you hear something buried in it, a name, a sentence, a song half remembered, but it's never clear, never complete, just almost. And that almost is its magic. There is something achingly human about a radio still tuned to static. It mirrors the way we sometimes keep talking after no one is there to hear us. The way we leave lights on in empty rooms or carry on conversations with people who have long since left. The static is a stand-in for memory and focused, persistent, filled with fragments of once sharp things. In a dusty room with fading wallpaper and the scent of old wood, the radio glows faintly. It might sit on a shelf, its antenna slightly bent, reaching not for better reception anymore, but simply existing in that upward stretch. The room accepts it. The walls remember music that once danced along them. The chairs still face where someone once sat and listened. The air itself holds the echo of days when the voice coming from the radio mattered. And yet, the static is not sad. It is not a mournful sound. It is gentle, almost comforting, like rain on a distant roof. Like when moving through the trees at night, it keeps company. It fills the spaces that might otherwise feel hollow. Its constancy becomes a kind of reassurance something continues. Something is still reaching, still sounding, even if no one is listening. Sometimes, people walk past rooms like these and don't notice the sound. They've tuned their lives to sharper frequencies, alarms, notifications, updates. Static doesn't ask for attention. It's not loud. It doesn't clamor. It simply continues. Like breath, like time. But for those who pause, who step into the quiet and listen, the static offers something rare. A moment of suspended being. It doesn't tell you what to feel. It doesn't rush you forward. It offers only presence. It says, you are here. This moment exists. Even if no message is coming through, the air is full. Somewhere in that haze of noise are the ghost signals of 1,000 stories, broadcast from decades ago, still traveling outward in waves that never quite vanish. They pass through walls, bodies, and clouds, continuing in all directions. The radio doesn't catch them all, but it's still trying. That effort, that invisible stretch toward connection, is what makes the static so poignant. It's not failure, it's persistence. There is poetry in that. A kind of quiet devotion. The radio, left on, doesn't care that it's no longer useful in the way it once was. It still works, in its way. It still offers sound to an empty room. It still hums its quiet lullaby of what could be, what once was, and what almost is. Sometimes, people leave radios on for company, not because they're listening, but because the presence of sound reminds them they are not alone. The static becomes a stand-in for someone in the next room, a reminder that something is still happening, even if it's just air moving against air. Late at night, especially in rooms where sleep comes slowly, the static becomes something more. It softens the edges of thought. It lets the mind wander without needing to arrive. You begin to match its rhythm, to breathe with it. Its rise and fall mirrors your own, until you are no longer entirely sure if the sound is coming from the speaker or from somewhere inside yourself. And that's the other truth about static. It reflects. It catches the edges of whatever you bring into the room. If you arrive full of longing, the static sounds like reaching. If you are grieving, it sounds like absence. If you are tired, it sounds like rest. And if you are ready for nothing at all, it becomes the perfect companion, present, but asking nothing of you. In some forgotten corners of the world, the radios are still on. In attics where no one climbs. In the back rooms of old shops. In cabins where the floorboards creak with every step. In quiet homes where someone left and didn't return, but the sound stayed behind. The static still plays, like a candle that forgot to burn out. And maybe it always will. Maybe, in a way, it should. Because not every sound needs to be clear. Not every message needs to be decoded. Some things are meant to be felt rather than understood. Some rooms are made to hold the noise between signals, to cradle the hush between words. You don't need to turn the dial. You don't need to search for a clearer station. You can stay here, in this moment, Let the sound wash over you. Let it become the ceiling under which you sleep. The pulse that doesn't interrupt but calms. The quiet that is never quite quiet. Tonight, as you drift, imagine the old radio in some forgotten place. Still glowing, still humming, still holding space for everything that ever tried to be heard. Not gone, not silent, just tuned into the in-between. Holding time is not in minutes, but in waves. Holding presence not in words, but in sound. And maybe, as you fall into sleep, you'll begin to hear it differently, not as static, but as a kind of lullaby, a song with no melody, no chorus, and no end. Just the gentle reassurance that something, somewhere, is still reaching out, still trying, still here. There was a window, just one, that framed the world in a way that never quite changed. Not large or decorative, not adorned with curtains that swayed or stained glass panes that colored the light. It was plain, a pane of slightly warped glass, bordered by flaking wood, smudged with the dust of years. But it offered a view consistent, fixed, and unremarkably reliable. And every day, the same eyes looked out through it. They did not skim the horizon for something new. They did not wait for messengers or lovers or miracles. These eyes, steady, quiet, patient, looked not to be surprised, but simply to see. And so they returned, again and again, each morning, to the same view. The scene it offered was modest. A patch of grass edged by stone, a road worn smooth by time, and the curve of a low wall beyond which the roofs of neighboring houses peeked into view. Sometimes, a bicycle passed. Sometimes a cat. Occasionally, the postman would pause, straighten his cap, and move on. Trees lined the background, and if you looked closely, you could see how they changed, not dramatically, not in declarations, but in whispers. The slightest unfurling of a leaf, the soft sag of branches under snow, the way morning light touched them differently in April than it did in November. But the changes were slow, almost imperceptible. So slow, in fact, that only someone who looked every day, someone who devoted their sight, could chart them. And so these eyes, weary with years but sharpened with memory, became recorders of stillness, witnesses to the subtle. They belonged to a woman who had lived in the same house for most of her life. She had once walked beyond the window, had once known the scent of rain on the stones, just past the gate, and had once shouted a greeting across the road and waved to the neighbor, who had long since stopped appearing. But now, her movement was confined. Her feet touched only a few parts of the house: her chair, her bed, and the table where she brewed tea from old leaves she reused out of habit, not necessity. And the window, always the window. Each day, she drew the chair closer. The legs made a faint drag across the wooden floor, a sound like a sigh. She would sit, hands folded, and let her gaze rest on the world she already knew by heart. She did not look for something. She looked at it. The difference mattered. There was no hunger in her gaze, no seeking, only presence. She could tell the time by the way the shadows fell on the wall across the lane. She could sense the coming of rain not by scent, but by the way the air made the leaves still. She noted the boy who once rode his scooter up and down and now walked home in a suit, head lowered. She remembered the woman who used to tend the garden with red gloves and now only opened the door to bring in groceries. She saw things change, not in bursts, but in decay and growth so finely braided they became indistinguishable. Some might call the view unchanging, but she knew better. The sameness held secrets. In the repetition, she learned reverence. She saw how the world didn't need to announce itself to be alive. The world breathed in the stillness. The world turned not with applause, but with patience. And she had, over time, become part of it. There had been a time long ago when the view was new to her. When she had first moved into the house, the window had seemed just another fixture, a frame for light, a means to check the weather. In those years, her life moved fast. Children underfoot, meals cooked and burned and cooked again, comings and goings, urgent errands, shouts across the hallway. 1,000 distractions. Back then, she barely noticed the view. The window was something glanced through, not lingered at. But then, the world slowed, or perhaps it was she who slowed. The house emptied, as houses do, one room at a time. The silence settled in. Children grew into postcards. Birthdays turned into phone calls. The kettle whistled, and no one came running. The days became long, and the view became a companion. At first, she mourned its stillness. She longed for drama, for the old chaos of movement. But slowly, the view taught her otherwise. It taught her that repetition is not stagnation. It is rhythm. It is continuity. It is the earth's heartbeat heard through the floorboards. The same tree outside the gate, when looked at daily, revealed 100 different greens. The same bench down the lane held countless shadows depending on the hour. The same stone wall bore the footprints of birds in the morning dew. She became a connoisseur of the ordinary. She noticed the way the wind worked differently on Mondays, as if still recovering from Sunday's quiet. She watched clouds arrange themselves into formations she never named, but always remembered. She saw the way light poured through the gaps between things not on, but between, and she came to love those in-between spaces the most. Sometimes, visitors came. Not often, but sometimes. They would glance out the window and see nothing. They would turn back to her with sympathetic smiles and ask how she passed the time. She would nod politely, not out of agreement, but out of understanding. She knew they didn't see it. She knew they saw stillness as emptiness. But her time passed in observation, in communion with a world that moved in smaller ways. She never wrote it down. No journal, no sketches, no calendar marks. She trusted her eyes, and her eyes trusted her. They grew old together, those eyes and that view. Both faded slightly over time, and both softened at the edges. But both remained loyal, and every day, they met again. She sat by the window, a blanket draped over her knees, and the day began not with a clock, but with a look. The first look was always the same, a quiet taking in. She would let her gaze settle into the world as if stepping into a warm bath. She would breathe out slowly, not to sigh, but to sink. Sometimes, she whispered good morning to the tree. Sometimes, she hummed as she watched a bird hop along the fence. Often, she said nothing. The silence was not emptiness. It was full of regard. The house made its own noises, the creak of settling beams, the tick of the old clock, and the faint shudder of pipes deep in the walls. But she paid no mind to these. Her mind was outside, across the glass, watching the world not asked to be watched. And perhaps that was the greatest gift. The world outside her window had no awareness of her. It did not perform. It did not respond. It was not a mirror, asking for praise or complaint. It simply was. And because it was, she could simply be. There were days the weather turned severe storms that lashed at the panes, snow that smothered the street into silence. Even then, she looked. Especially then, she watched the violence of the sky without fear. It was another version of the same world, still hers, still part of the view. And in the night, when the world dimmed and the street lamps hummed in their halos, she looked again. She could see less, but she felt more. The darkness sharpened her memory. She could picture the tree, the stones, and the road even when hidden. She did not need the light to know they remained. There would come a time, she suspected, when she would no longer wake, when the chair by the window would sit empty, when the house, already half ghosted, would carry on its quiet routines without her. The window would remain, the view would persist, but the eyes would be closed. And still, she felt no sadness, because the view had lived within her, and in a way, she had lived within it. They had observed one another, day after day, year after year, and in doing so, had created something sacred. Not grand, not memorable, but deeply human. Some people spend lifetimes chasing sights that change them. She had spent hers seeing one that revealed itself slowly and never stopped speaking. So she looked, as always, and the view looked back, as always, not with eyes, but with presence, with being. They met there, in that quiet ritual, every day, and that was enough. There was a window, just one, that framed the world in a way that never quite changed. Not large or decorative, not adorned with curtains that swayed or stained glass panes that colored the light. It was plain, a pane of slightly warped glass, bordered by flaking wood, smudged with the dust of years. But it offered a view consistent, fixed, and unremarkably reliable. And every day, the same eyes looked out through it. They did not skim the horizon for something new. They did not wait for messengers or lovers or miracles. These eyes, steady, quiet, patient, looked not to be surprised, but simply to see. And so they returned, again and again, each morning, to the same view. The scene it offered was modest. A patch of grass edged by stone, a road worn smooth by time, and the curve of a low wall beyond which the roofs of neighboring houses peeked into view. Sometimes, a bicycle passed. Sometimes a cat. Occasionally, the postman would pause, straighten his cap, and move on. Trees lined the background, and if you looked closely, you could see how they changed, not dramatically, not in declarations, but in whispers. The slightest unfurling of a leaf, the soft sag of branches under snow, the way morning light touched them differently in April than it did in November. But the changes were slow, almost imperceptible. So slow, in fact, that only someone who looked every day, someone who devoted their sight, could chart them. And so these eyes, weary with years but sharpened with memory, became recorders of stillness, witnesses to the subtle. They belonged to a woman who had lived in the same house for most of her life. She had once walked beyond the window, had once known the scent of rain on the stones just past the gate, and had once shouted a greeting across the road and waved to the neighbor, who had long since stopped appearing. But now, her movement was confined. Her feet touched only a few parts of the house: her chair, her bed, and the table where she brewed tea from old leaves she reused out of habit, not necessity. And the window, always the window. Each day, she drew the chair closer. The legs made a faint drag across the wooden floor, a sound like a sigh. She would sit, hands folded, and let her gaze rest on the world she already knew by heart. She did not look for something. She looked at it. The difference mattered. There was no hunger in her gaze, no seeking, only presence. She could tell the time by the way the shadows fell on the wall across the lane. She could sense the coming of rain not by scent, but by the way the air made the leaves still. She noted the boy who once rode his scooter up and down and now walked home in a suit, head lowered. She remembered the woman who used to tend the garden with red gloves and now only opened the door to bring in groceries. She saw things change, not in bursts, but in decay and growth so finely braided they became indistinguishable. Some might call the view unchanging, but she knew better. The sameness held secrets. In the repetition, she learned reverence. She saw how the world didn't need to announce itself to be alive. The world breathed in the stillness. The world turned not with applause, but with patience. And she had, over time, become part of it. There had been a time long ago when the view was new to her. When she had first moved into the house, the window had seemed just another fixture, a frame for light, a means to check the weather. In those years, her life moved fast. Children underfoot, meals cooked and burned and cooked again, comings and goings, urgent errands, shouts across the hallway. 1,000 distractions. Back then, she barely noticed the view. The window was something glanced through, not lingered at. But then, the world slowed, or perhaps it was she who slowed. The house emptied, as houses do, one room at a time. The silence settled in. Children grew into postcards. Birthdays turned into phone calls. The kettle whistled, and no one came running. The days became long, and the view became a companion. At first, she mourned its stillness. She longed for drama, for the old chaos of movement. But slowly, the view taught her otherwise. It taught her that repetition is not stagnation. It is rhythm. It is continuity. It is the earth's heartbeat heard through the floorboards. The same tree outside the gate, when looked at daily, revealed 100 different greens. The same bench down the lane held countless shadows depending on the hour. The same stone wall bore the footprints of birds in the morning dew. She became a connoisseur of the ordinary. She noticed the way the wind worked differently on Mondays, as if still recovering from Sunday's quiet. She watched clouds arrange themselves into formations she never named, but always remembered. She saw the way light poured through the gaps between things not on, But between and she came to love those in between spaces the most. Sometimes visitors came, not often, but sometimes. They would glance out the window and see nothing. They would turn back to her with sympathetic smiles and ask how she passed the time. She would nod politely, not out of agreement, but out of understanding. She knew they didn't see it. She knew they saw stillness as emptiness. But her time passed in observation, in communion with a world that moved in smaller ways. She never wrote it down. No journal, no sketches, no calendar marks. She trusted her eyes, and her eyes trusted her. They grew old together, those eyes and that view. Both faded slightly over time, and both softened at the edges. But both remained loyal, and every day they met again. She sat by the window, a blanket draped over her knees, and the day began not with a clock, but with a look. The first look was always the same, a quiet taking in. She would let her gaze settle into the world as if stepping into a warm bath. She would breathe out slowly, not to sigh, but to sink. Sometimes she whispered good morning to the tree. Sometimes she hummed as she watched a bird hop along the fence. Often she said nothing. The silence was not emptiness. It was full of regard. The house made its own noises, the creak of settling beams, the tick of the old clock, and the faint shudder of pipes deep in the walls. But she paid no mind to these. Her mind was outside, across the glass, watching the world not asked to be watched. And perhaps that was the greatest gift. The world outside her window had no awareness of her. It did not perform. It did not respond. It was not a mirror, asking for praise or complaint. It simply was. And because it was, she could simply be. There were days the weather turned severe storms that lashed at the panes, snow that smothered the street into silence. Even then, she looked. Especially then, she watched the violence of the sky without fear. It was another version of the same world, still hers, still part of the view. And in the night, when the world dimmed and the street lamps hummed in their halos, she looked again. She could see less, but she felt more. The darkness sharpened her memory. She could picture the tree, the stones, and the road even when hidden. She did not need the light to know they remained. There would come a time, she suspected, when she would no longer wake, when the chair by the window would sit empty, when the house, already half ghosted, would carry on its quiet routines without her. The window would remain, the view would persist, but the eyes would be closed. And still, she felt no sadness, because the view had lived within her, and in a way, she had lived within it. They had observed one another, day after day, year after year, and in doing so, had created something sacred. Not grand, not memorable, but deeply human. Some people spend lifetimes chasing sights that change them. She had spent hers seeing one that revealed itself slowly and never stopped speaking. So she looked, as always, and the view looked back, as always, not with eyes, but with presence, with being. They met there, in that quiet ritual, every day, and that was enough.